Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's timely program entitled Election 2020, Where Do We Go From Here? My name is Chuck Lewis. I was a trustee of the university for a decade and have been deeply involved with the College Career Advancement, SSA, SSD, and the Urban Education Institute. I am also an amateur observer of politics, and since 2007 have written limited edition commentaries, variously called Obamograms, Pete Posts, and most recently, Biden Briefs. This week's events have brought into sharp focus the polarization that continues to plague our politics. We also saw the highest voter turnout of any election since 1876. Both that 1876 election and this one were protracted affairs and held an unflattering mirror up to our country and its electorate, much like the 1968 election did. Joe Biden is the president-elect of the United States, but the current president is not going quietly. So where do we go from here is indeed the pressing question of the day. And I cannot imagine a more qualified panel of experts to explore this question than the one we have here tonight. First, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor William Howell, who will be moderating our discussion. Will is a Sidney Stein Professor in American Politics at the Harris School, a professor in political science and in the college, and the director of the Center for Effective Government. He has written widely on separation of powers issues in American political institutions, especially the presidency. He is currently working on research projects, including the normative foundations of executive power. And I would emphasize the word normative. He is the author of several books, most recently, Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy. How apt is that? I heard Will on a panel last month at the Humanities Festival, and last week on both a UChicago panel and on CNBC, so he's in much demand. I should say, in reciting bios like this, I always come away feeling badly. And now to our panelists. As most of you know, David Axelrod is a leading political commentator and the former chief strategist and senior advisor to President Barack Obama. I recall meeting David first in 2003. David, an alumnus of the college, is now a distinguished senior fellow at the Harris School, is founding director of the university's Institute of Politics, and is a senior commentator for CNN, where we heard him nonstop last week. He is also the host of the top-rated Axe Files podcast. David is also the author of the best-selling memoir, Believer, My 40 Years in Politics. Catherine Baker is a leading scholar in the economic analysis of health policy and currently serves as the dean and the Emmett Dedman Professor at the Harris School. Kate's research focuses on the effect of health system reform, a hot topic during the campaign and once again before the Supreme Court. Kate has been elected to many bodies, including the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Among other things, she serves on the Congressional Budget Office's panel of health advisors, is a trustee of the Mayo Clinic and is on the board of directors of Eli Lilly. As you may know, Lilly is in the spotlight currently for its new COVID treatments. And finally, I want to note that Damon Jones, an associate professor at the Harris School, was slated to be here, but at the last minute had a conflict. So thank you all for joining us this evening, and I will turn it over to Will.
Terrific. Thank you, Chuck. And what a pleasure it is to be joined with David and Kate in this moment. It is an anxious moment and a divided moment and a tumultuous moment in many ways for our country. And your charge is to give us some bearings and to give us some perspective, to get a sense of the bigger picture. I think we've been, I've just recently slowed down on how many times I refresh my page on election returns but we're not here to kind of gather in that spirit so much as it is to try to take stock of where we've been and where we're going at a slightly higher level. And yes, it's too bad that Damon Jones couldn't join us. While we're going to be talking about how we get our bearings, he actually is setting to work on doing some good work for the Biden administration. And so Kate and David, look, when years from now, when the history of 2020 is written, it's going to be told about a pandemic and tumultuous politics and a presidential campaign. Those are going to be the two top lines. And we're going to be trying to make sense of both them individually and how they interact with one another. And both of you have a deep well of experience in these spaces. And so let's get after it if we can. Kate, if I could start with you. Look, this pandemic has had an enormous toll on our country. We're at 242,000 people and counting who have died. We still don't know what the long-term health implications are going to be for those people who suffered but may have recovered. The elective surgeries that were put off, mental health that has suffered under the weight of this pandemic. And there's been a lot of talk about how the government ought to respond in its capacity. And we should note from the top, there's sort of governments, really. It's the federal government, but also a lot of activity at the state level. And as you were sort of thinking about the stakes involved with these elections, let's note, there's a presidential election, but these elections, the stakes involved in terms of how the country would respond to this unfolding and mounting pandemic. What sort of thoughts, how were you making sense of it? What are the stakes involved to your mind?
Well, in so many public policy issues, we say the stakes are life and death, but it really is life and death right now. And we've seen the sort of out of control spread of the pandemic in a way that's overwhelming healthcare systems, that's exacerbating an economic deep recession that is disproportionately hurting the very same populations that are disproportionately harmed by the pandemic. So it's really a very fraught situation for so many families around the country. And the stakes are only getting higher, not just because the illness rate and death toll is mounting, but because of the good news too. There's been great news in the last week about the potential efficacy of a vaccine, about the availability of therapeutics. All of that is great news in the long run. And the question is, how quickly can we get to that long run? And it's not tomorrow, and it's not next month. It's going to take, in the best case scenario, months and months to distribute, administer, track a vaccine, to distribute limited doses of therapeutics, all at the same time that we really need to be suppressing spread of the disease. And it's all the same people who need to do that. It's the same healthcare systems. It's the same local, state, national policymakers. So the importance of national leadership right now in disseminating best public health practices, in coordinating the logistics involved with a massive distribution effort that we hope is just around the corner. All of that just means that those political leadership roles are of even more vital importance. And I'm sure that this will be top of the list for the incoming administration, the way it is for governors and mayors and local healthcare workers around the country and around the world.
So are there, when you think about then stakes, there are concerns about like capacity and building out these systems. There also are like policy choices that one may make. And later on, we'll talk about the Affordable Care Act. We'll get to that. But right now, let's just think about the nation's marshaling a response to this crisis. Was it your sense that not just vis-a-vis Biden and Trump, but Democrats and Republicans around the country, that there are different takes on how we might respond, different policy choices that might be made that also figure into our assessment of the stakes involved in these elections?
Well, that seems like an understatement to me.
Yeah.
That you see such different perceptions of the underlying risks, of the validity of the science, of the best practices that people ought to be adopting, of the role of the government. This varies wildly across the country, like views of so many other things. And this is perhaps a good segue to David, because it seems like an era of unprecedented polarization in views on policy, but that is then infecting, so to speak, people's views of the underlying health risks and what ought to be done about it. And that highlights the importance of not only the policy in marshaling resources, in coordinating health responses, economic responses, infrastructure, but also of messaging and consistent communication about best practices and about risks. It's understandable that large swaths of the public throw up their hands when they're hearing so many different things from different people and don't know where the truth lies in terms of the science, let alone what the best policy is. I think there's a strong role for public health messaging, coupled with all of those logistical things and coupled with all of the resources that we need. That messaging turns out to matter a lot in terms of behavior, and behavior is what drives the spread of the disease.
And right now, at least in this moment, as we're on the incline, tragically, we're looking at 1,500 people a day now, roughly, who are dying at the hands of this disease. We're not getting any messaging from the White House right now. No. And instead, there's, in the fallout of this election, David, there is a turn towards, claims about fraud and illegitimacy. And we've gone sort of silent on the pandemic. And how do we make sense of this? That we're accustomed to thinking about presidents standing out in front and claiming responsibility for crises. And we're not hearing anything on that front. At the same time, there is kind of a full frontal assault with what evidence or lack of evidence is available to them in order to push back on this election. What's playing out right now?
Well, first of all, anyone who served in the White House should have a profound sense of just how powerful the words of a president can be. And one of the things that has plagued us during this siege with the coronavirus has been inconsistent guidance, and often guidance that conflicts with the guidance or words that conflict with the guidance that the government is giving to people. So the president chose this peculiar role of being both the president of the government that was trying to offer guidance to the American people about how to deal with the virus, and the leader of the resistance to that guidance. And that discordance has been very costly, I think. Now we have a situation where the virus is reaching new peaks and is more perilous than ever, and we're having to retrace steps and, as we've seen in Illinois, go back to a much more cloistered approach to this. And we haven't heard from the President of the United States on this not since Election Day. Before Election Day, his message was this was all media creation and it wasn't going to be talked about after Election Day. I think that's created a lot of confusion. And to your other point, at the same time, we have an election that is very clearly over by all sort of standards that we would normally apply. Joe Biden has won. He's winning the popular vote by more than 5 million. He's won 306 electoral votes, apparently. And that is the same exact number the president won last time. The transition process began almost immediately when the last President Trump was elected from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. It is not happening now. And there's all this confusion being sowed about the sanctity and trust that people can have in the most sacred process there is in our democracy, which is an election, even as, and I think this should be noted, even as we just had, as Chuck mentioned, the greatest turnout in 150 years, conducted under the most difficult circumstances we have faced in modern times with this pandemic. And the thing about it that's so noteworthy is how few problems there were, how little fraud was reported, how the systems actually worked. But there is real doubt, division in the country. 70% of Republicans said that they thought the election wasn't free and fair. So I think these two things added together speak to how much the bully pulpit of the presidency means and how much the words of a president means. And, there are profound impacts for trust in our institutions. And in the case of the virus, there are profound impacts for how and whether we can control it.
And David's point about the transition is so vital because in any circumstances, it's a huge lift to ramp up a new administration, even when people are really experienced. But we're in the middle of a pandemic and money is running out for supporting businesses and families, and the government needs to keep running. And there are so many things that we don't have months to wait on to get started in January, would again cost lives more than any other period. So it's a little alarming to imagine that is not proceeding as smoothly as it could.
Not to mention that President-elect Biden has appointed his own coronavirus task force, but there's no indication that there's any coordination between that task force and the one that exists right now, which is going to have to oversee this process during this very critical period when there may be a vaccine and the whole plan for dissemination of that vaccine is to move forward. That seems very fraught to me. The fact that these two groups of people who have these responsibilities are not speaking with each other.
Yeah, I mean, it's fraught. There are layers to just how fraught this moment is. There are concerns about the health of our democracy and trust in institutions, the efficacy of the electoral process. Just as there is this rising pandemic, there's possibly hope around the corner. There's not all the news is bad, Kate, as you point out, but there are immense challenges. And then there's this handoff that's supposed to be happening, but that is not happening. And Kate, as you point out, it's not just a matter of closing the door on your way out. It is the whole teams that need to be built out, and appointments that need to be made, and information that needs to be shared. And David, you got to see up close the transition in 2008, which was we saw the transition from one major party to another. Are there points of contrast between what you're seeing now and what you saw then? There obviously are.
Yeah, I think this comes under the heading of a rhetorical question.
Yes.
But, no, it was completely different. Hours after the election in 2008, the ascertainment document that the General Services Administration needed to sign was signed, and the transition began. Office space was made available. We had landing teams that arrived at every federal agency. And I must say, and I say this wherever I go, I am forever grateful for the level of cooperation that we received from the very first from President Bush. And it wasn't that he loved everything that we said in that campaign. We had some very harsh criticism of the way he had, of some of the decisions that he had made. But he saw it as his responsibility as a trustee of this democracy to see to it that his successor got off to a good start and had everything that he needed and that his team needed. And I will tell you that the night before the inauguration and the day before the inauguration, the Homeland Security teams of the outgoing administration and the incoming administration were together dealing with a potential threat on the inaugural ceremonies that was quite serious and concerning. There was no question but that we were all on one team, that we shared a responsibility, and their responsibility ended at noon on January 20th. But until then, they were going to work with us to make sure that the handoff was complete. None of that is happening now. None of that is happening now. I think that President-elect Biden has tried to downplay the impact of this and indicate that we're moving forward. And that's probably the right thing to do, because I don't think you want to create a panic in the country that things that should be going on aren't going on, or that somehow this isn't going to end in the appropriate way. But the honest truth is, this is very damaging, and all you need to do is look at the 9/11 report about what happened back in 2000 when it wasn't clear who had won the election, and the transition was held up until late December. And that was one of the items that was cited as having slowed down the new administration in doing the things that were necessary to get their arms around some of these threats. So there are serious consequences to this, and it's deeply concerning.
Kate, do you worry about, both of these fronts, both the concern about the handoff to the extent that it's happening, right? That this is not, the information isn't being shared, there isn't coordination, and concern about the lack of trust in institutions and lack of trust in political elites more generally. Both of those things will hamper in the weeks and months ahead our effort to deal with this pandemic, no?
I very much agree. I think there's some, short-term enormous decisions that need to be made about infrastructure for distribution of medicines, about what the right stance is for trying to stem this rise in incidence of the disease. Hospitals in parts of the country already overwhelmed. That's obviously immediate, but there's this longer term erosion in faith in deliberative policymaking, evidence, being held to account for a set of facts, for truth telling. At the Harris School, we are dedicated to analytical approaches to policymaking, to grounding decisions in evidence and rigorous thinking. The erosion of that can have really long-term consequences for how the public views the right functioning of government, the effective functioning of government, which we care about very deeply, but also who wants to go into government, what kind of civil servants do we have to keep things going during difficult times if we've sort of weeded out the people who are focused on that kind of deliberative analytical process. I don't know how we recover from that.
This is so important, Will, because we can have robust debates about problems and around a set of facts about what approach we should take to them. But if we can't agree on the nature of those problems, if we can't agree on basic facts, is climate change real? Basic facts about this virus and how it spreads and how we can prevent it and so on. If those become fodder for political sparring and facts become fungible, that's a very, very dangerous thing. The other thing that I would say is, I've lived through a lot of changes of administration, and some I've liked and some I've not. But the thing that I never doubted was that the people who got elected had some appreciation for the fundamental institutions, rules, laws, and norms of our democracy. And what we've learned, I think, is that so much depends on the goodwill of people who serve. So much depends, you've written a lot about the executive, so much depends on the goodwill of the president. And if the president doesn't treat these institutions with care, if the president has, sunders our democratic norms, then that is very disruptive. We take our democracy for granted. We should not. That's what we've learned. We should not take our democracy for granted. They require vigilance in support of these institutions and norms. And without them, we have a shaky foundation.
And if I could add to this, we also are going to have a much more difficult time actually solving the problem. So we were talking just before we got onto this call about how Mayor Lightfoot has come out and recommended that people starting on Monday stay at home. How people understand her and that edict and their willingness to abide it is going to depend in no small part on their trust in political elites or their trust in her as mayor. And if significant portions of Chicago, if significant portions of the country look up and say, you, Anthony Fauci, and your advice, you just have an axe to grind here, we're going to have a hard time making headway because policy can only take us so far. And the deployment of resources by a government can only take us so far. We also need to enlist the kind of the free and independent choices of individuals to do right in this instance. Okay, so lots in play. But I want to hear, we're going to be transitioning not just to a new president, but to a new Congress. And all signs point to, a bare majority of Democrats in the House, and most likely a Republican majority in the Senate. It's possible that Democrats win both of these the Senate runoffs in Georgia. David, you'll tell us whether or not what the odds are there. I'm going to suggest it's certainly less than 50-50.
Yes, you'd be right.
Right. So, Kate, when we think about the work ahead, it's not just about how do we meet the pressing needs of the pandemic. There also is the healthcare system more generally and needs to fix the Affordable Care Act or amend it in a variety of ways. There are challenges ongoing in the courts. Can you say a little bit about, as best you can tell, what needs fixing when we think about how we need to fix healthcare in the country? And then pair that against what do you see as actually being possible, where we can make inroads, given the composition of Congress, given the partisan divides that we see?
Yeah, there's healthcare beyond the COVID pandemic. I hope we get to beyond the COVID pandemic sooner rather than later. But even during the pandemic, there are these pressing healthcare needs that have nothing to do with the disease. People are still getting cancer and having babies and having heart attacks, and all of these things are manifest in the need for a healthcare system ongoing reform and refinement. Now, there's huge disagreement about whether that should look like a single payer system or refining the existing Affordable Care Act or moving to a different system altogether. What's likely to happen is pretty constrained in what looks like the likely outcome of a Republican-controlled Senate, Democratic president-elect, bare majority for the Democrats in the House. That, to me, suggests that legislative action is unlikely in the overhaul the healthcare system sense. So we can sort of take off the table some of those really big changes that some people advocate for. And what you're left with is a pretty narrow set of things to do within the existing law in terms of the way states cover populations with Medicaid, what kind of waivers they get to try innovative insurance coverage, how we pay for care in Medicare, can we drive towards higher value care, fixing some things about the health insurance exchanges where people get private health insurance with the vast, who don't get it through their employer, but the vast majority of people who are privately insured are getting it through their employer. And then there are millions of people who are falling through the cracks. And how you cover people who aren't currently covered by one of those patchwork systems, and how you get healthcare spending devoted to care that's a really high health value, so that we can get more health for every dollar we spend, maybe spend a little less and have more money left over for things like education and transportation and housing. The levers available are looking much narrower with the divided government than they would have with unified control in either party.
And yet we've had a year where the vulnerabilities of our healthcare system have been laid plain, and the costs of those vulnerabilities have been laid plain. And a primary season, at least among the Democrats, wherein the hopes of people who are centrist and left thereof have been lifted, that, oh, we can imagine anew, right, a single payer healthcare system. I mean, and if at the end of the day, what we get is a little marginal change, right, in the face of overwhelming need and heightened kind of hopes and aspirations, David, does that just lead to more despondence and disaffection?
That is my fear. Biden, he staked out a kind of center-left position on healthcare. His changes were significant, but they weren't so dramatic as to portend upheaval in the healthcare system. He wants to add a public option to the private exchanges. He wants to lower the age in which people can buy into Medicare. There's a series of he wants to plus up subsidies for people within those exchanges. There's a series of things he wants to do that Kate knows even more in greater detail than I do, for sure. But it's very unlikely, as Kate says, that that's going to happen if as you suggest, Republicans have control after January 5th. And I do worry about this. I worry about, I experienced it myself when I was in the administration. We got elected. I'll never forget driving up to a rally toward the end of our campaign in 2008. And there were, I think, 80,000 people waiting for us at this rally. And they all had these signs with that iconic lithograph of Obama on it that said hope and change. And he turned to me and he said, we'll never be able to meet their expectations. And I think that this, Biden, even though the expectations may have been more modest, I think that it's going to be hard for him to meet them. And, I've heard people say, well, it's great, the divided government, that will keep him in check, that will keep the left in check. That will help Biden keep the left in check. But I think he has to deliver here. And if he doesn't, there's going to be a lot of disquiet in his own base, and there'll be a lot of disquiet in the other base. And I'd be concerned about that, about his inability to do that. And by the way, it's not just on healthcare, but he had a pretty significant economic plan that involved changes in the tax system, some reversals of some of the Trump tax cuts to pay for a massive infrastructure program, to childcare tax credits, and some other things that it seems to me are going to be very hard to achieve now.
Yeah, and when you say delivering, that can mean a number of things. It can mean delivering to the people who got you into this position of power. It can also mean deliver in that, like, we have real problems, like we've got to get a handle on here. Yeah. And if what we do going forward is have a system of government that just is sclerotic, is stuck, because we have these acute divisions and bare majorities, and we can't get traction in actually solving the problem one way or another, that too constitutes a kind of rot to our democracy.
Yes, and an instability that will grow. My concern is that we have a system that was devised to move slowly when the country is divided, and we live in times when change is coming at us at a more rapid rate than ever because of the march of technology and so on, and that's been felt deeply in our economy. And we've seen this great polarity in terms of income inequality. like every crisis, been exacerbated by this crisis as well. And we need to, when I say deliver, I think, Biden's focus was on trying to narrow that gap, on trying to make sure that people who work for a living can support their families, and trying to ensure that people could get affordable healthcare, on trying to ensure that people who want to work can get childcare that they can rely on and they can pay for and they can afford. These are quality of life things that this is how people measure their lives.
Mhm.
And the inability to make any progress on any of these issues, I think just the pot will continue to boil even more rapidly than it has already.
Mhm. So one move that sometimes people make is to say, well, we're stuck at the national level. We're not going to make progress there. Let's think about the state or local level. Kate, do you see in the area that you know best in healthcare policy, are there points of promise, innovation that's happening at the state level or at the local level, and that maybe that's where we ought to sort of look at a time of national gridlock and polarization between the two major parties?
Yeah, I think that that's an avenue for potential innovation in healthcare, but in some of the other crucial realms that you've mentioned as well. The state
Yeah.
Medicaid, the federal government and the states jointly run Medicaid, the health insurance plan for mostly low-income populations. And states can experiment with different ways of covering people with innovative services if they get a federal waiver. And the waivers that'll be granted under Biden administration are probably going to look pretty different from the waivers that were granted under a Trump administration. So you may see a very different kind of state experimentation with that aspect of the safety net insurance for low-income populations. But there are other social insurance programs that maybe states and even cities have the opportunity to do a little more experimentation and innovation. You see, the Damon Jones and others have done work on the importance of an economic cushion, the resilience that it gives families to just have a small amount of savings to weather a car breaking down or loss of hours, loss of a shift at a job. There's so many small economic setbacks that are not small to the people who are experiencing them when they don't have that kind of safety net. There are states and localities experimenting with universal basic income or ways to try to provide more of a financial safety net. Education, clearly of vital importance to improving the economic opportunities for generations to come. Federal government does not play a very big role in elementary and secondary education. In some states, the states play a larger role. In some states, it's all localities, but that's another area where the investment decisions are made largely at a state or local level. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, which is not to say that, within states, everyone agrees and policy is all marching off productively. We have a lot of the same challenges that you see nationally mirrored at lower levels. But I agree with the premise of your question that at least in recent experience, there's been potentially a lot more experimentation done when you leave the federal government out of it.
Well, let me just add one thing. I think the federal government, we saw some of this in the Obama administration. The federal government can play a catalytic role in incentivizing experimentation and change. I know it's hotly debated, but the Race to the Top program on education actually produced quite a bit of change at the state level. There was a competition for energy dollars to innovate around the development of batteries for storage of energy that is important to the electric car development. And so, a creative government, federal government, even constrained, can do some very important things.
David, I wrote this. If I could I got to plug myself here. Can I do that? I wrote a couple of papers that documented the effects of Race to the Top and Obama's waiver initiatives on state level policymaking. Huge effects. I mean, across the country at a time when it was all but impossible to make headway on those issues within Congress. And it wasn't like that Obama could have acted unilaterally and advance those kinds of changes. And yet he was able to leverage a little bit of money when it came to race to the top in order to affect
Yes.
widespread change.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So the federal government as partner is sort of an alternative model to the federal government
Mhm.
as the main driver that seems less likely in the next few years that we have. The federal government is partner to the states in catalyzing or facilitating. Federal government is partner to the private sector. When you, not to come back to healthcare, but when you look at the development of new medicines, vaccines, therapeutics, the federal government can play a really important catalyzing role, but you really need the kind of innovation and rapid movement that you can get with partnership with private sector innovation. And the government can shape that, can have really important balancing effects on distribution and equity, but it can't do it alone.
Yep. So there's a tradition, what we've left off are parties, and I think we should say something about parties. There's a tradition within political science that suggests that, the founders divided power vertically and horizontally, and the function of parties is to put them back together, or to create bridges across branches of government, or to allow for a level of coordination of the type, Kate, that you describe. That wouldn't occur if all we had were atomized individuals running for power and exercising whatever authority is vested in the office that they occupy. It's kind of a hopeful characterization of what we might get out of parties. But we live in an era of polarization at the elite level, and lack of trust and division. And we also are living in a period where what these parties stand for, and I want to single out the Republican Party here in particular, vis-a-vis its relationship to Trump, is very much being worked out in real time. And my sense is that part of what's going on with this contested election is in part a game that's not just about the transfer of power, but it's also about Trump's relationship to the Republican Party. I don't know if that resonates at all, David. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you see playing out. And you can pick either party, frankly, but I think that we see the Republican Party in particular being played out on our screens as we see people lining up behind him as he's contesting this election, with an eye towards, what is 2022 going to look like? What is 2024 going to look like? And what is the Republican Party going to stand for?
Look, I think that's going to be a big discussion. And I know there are a lot of hopeful never Trumpers who believe that if Trump were defeated, that Trumpism would be defeated as well. Remember, I mean, Trump got elected on an anti-immigrant protectionist platform that was quite different than, Mitt Romney's, 4 years earlier, John McCain's before that, and the party became an adjunct to Trump as much as Trump, a leader of the traditional party. And the core of the Republican base right now is a more populist base. And I also would add that I don't think that whether Trump, I think Trump is leaving the White House, but he's not leaving the scene. He's going to move down the block. He said he's going to, we hear he's going to have a leadership pack, might declare that he's going to run again in 2024. He's not going to cede leadership of the Republican Party back to more traditional Republican leaders. So I think that they've got a lot to sort out over there. On the Democratic side, there's a tug and pull. The base of the Democratic Party now is in metropolitan areas. It is a culturally liberal base. On economics, I think there's more division, but there is, and you saw it in some of the back and forth between members of Congress after the election. Members of the largest number of new members in Congress over the last 4 years have been in suburban areas. They were very, very leery of mentions of socialism. They were very uncomfortable with issues on policing, defund police, and so on. That became rallying cries for Trump, and probably helped some of the Republican candidates even more than it helped him. And Democrats need to sort out those differences within their own party. I would say that in terms of goals, there's more commonality between people on the Democratic side. Ultimately, everybody notionally wants healthcare for everyone that they can afford. Everybody wants access to education that is affordable. Everybody wants fair wages, and but there's a big difference about the pace and the nature of how we get there. And I think that battle will go on too. But it seems to me the Republicans have the more profound problem now, and they have to consider. A prominent Republican said to me the other day, "Our problem is we're growing where the country's shrinking, and we're shrinking where the country's growing." And I think that was a pretty apt way of summarizing the problem that they face.
We have a question that builds on your answer, David, that I want to bring forward. This is from Larry Strickling, our friend and neighbor here in Hyde Park, who's wondering, let's set aside Congress for the Senate for the moment and recognize that Trump is likely to stay front and center in public debates. How do you see this affecting Biden's ability to govern? And what recommendations would you offer to Biden on how to deal with Trump's continued presence in our national politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a big challenge for him, primarily because to the degree that Trump makes any sort of cooperation on issues tantamount to treason on the part of Republicans, it is going to really constrain Biden's ability to act. He's also going to be, commenting in real time on every aspect of what Biden is doing. I mean, I think that we've been told for some time, for example, it is going to take a period of months, and not just a few, but many, to get this vaccine to the largest number of Americans. And as sure as I'm sitting here, I'm sure you will hear from Trump come March or April. If I had been there, we would have gotten this vaccine to people right away. Mm-hmm. I mean, so in addition to the sort of structural issues of dealing with Republicans who are frightened of Trump, there is Trump using his platform to comment on a daily basis about what he perceives as the deficiencies of Biden. And no president has really faced that before.
Alexis asks, how much will the politicization of the federal workforce, particularly at the executive level, impact the execution of policy, especially with Schedule F executive order and the conversion of Trump political appointees to career positions at historic levels? The generalization of that is, Kate, think about the executive branch and the administrative state in which you have worked and overseen in important ways, has a mix of career sort of civil servants and also political appointees. How are we to think about the politicization of, the expansion of kind of politics and the intrusion of politics into the work of, well, agencies designed to deal with issues involving health or any number of other agencies to actually meet the challenges that they face?
Well, I'm sure David has views on this too, but I think, one person's deep state is another person's accumulated expertise in executing on the complicated business of government. And I think that there's an underappreciation for the vast expertise accumulated and the dedication of lots of civil servants aiming to implement policies that are challenging in the best of circumstances. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for innovation, and that it's really important that a president's vision be executed by having people he or she trusts in leadership positions at these agencies. But if people who have that level of experience and expertise flee government and don't come back, it's very hard, I think, to get anything productive done. So I hope people keep going into government and that we value those civil servants with experience and expertise as they partner with the political appointees who ought to be, a president is entitled to his cabinet, to the people a couple levels down who are actually helping to implement a particular set of policies. But I worry about the erosion of the necessary person power underneath that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Look, there isn't a president who at some time or another hasn't been frustrated by the bureaucracy and by, career people who may move more slowly on a priority or have different views on a priority. But I think most presidents also understand that wellspring of expertise is absolutely essential to the functioning of government. And most political appointees understand that ultimately, yes, they work for the president. Yes, the president has political priorities, but the functioning of government, the smooth functioning of government, is also a priority for the president, and working cooperatively with those career personnel is part of ensuring that.
Isn't this, though, something that, I mean, yes, the three of us all nod and say that's right, that is crucial, but I think there are significant portions of the public looks up at the federal government and sees the deep state and sees all kinds of lack of democratic accountability and failure and the swamp. And what we really need to do is shut them down. I mean, that not
Yeah.
everybody thinks that, but that strain of our politics is alive and well. And so it's a real challenge then for somebody who has these sensibilities, who wants to sort of vest discretion and cultivate support for an independent agencies and administrative expertise. That's hard work to do. We can't presuppose that it's simply going to sort of happen. No?
Yeah.
And there's a legitimate debate to be had about how big people want government to be, what services they want government to provide, what the most effective level of government to provide those services is. There's real discourse that we ought to be having about those fundamental questions of what is it that we want of our government, and people can legitimately disagree about that. That's not what the current debate feels like to me.
No. Well, let's just also note that people generally want the services and benefits that government can offer. They just don't necessarily want to pay for it, or they don't want and they don't want people, they don't want the people who have to deliver those services necessarily to have that much influence. But this has, as you suggest, Will, this has become part and parcel of our political time, which is that if people disagree with a decision of a government agency or disagree with government, then that is part of a conspiracy to defraud them of a just result. And we've seen that kind of whipped up. As I said, I've had my frustrations with the resistance of a bureaucracy to innovation. I've had those, and yes, there are times when money and lobbyists intrude in the process in ways that it should not. But by and large, I think people serve honorably, and they're trying to achieve a public good. And but they have been drawn into this conspiracy world that we live in. Mm-hmm. And the fact that QAnon now has representatives in Congress is quite alarming. And it tells you something about the state of our politics.
And the state of our media, which is a question that Cynthia has about. And we haven't said anything about the state of our media. We've seen dramatic changes in the nature of communication and the nature of public discourse. You both have recognized the importance of clear and consistent communication in dealing with a pandemic, and yet we have a highly fragmented media market. How do the two of you think about the role of the media in good government, and change or trends that you find disturbing, or trends that you find worth applauding, that that might breathe some life into our democracy?
Yeah, well, I think we've seen the good and the bad. Look, this has been, I think the media has been incredibly important during the last 4 years because, as I say, this as a former reporter, I mean, the role of the media, is in part to shine a bright light in those dark corners where we wouldn't necessarily see without them. And in a government that's been unusually opaque, this has become even more important. On the other hand, there is this tension between media as a trust, a public trust, and media as a business. And we're in a highly competitive environment in which the tussle for clicks and eyeballs is more intense than ever. And, partisanization has its rewards. The peddling of unproven theories has its rewards. There are a lot of responsible news organizations out there. There are also a lot of irresponsible organizations posing as news organizations, and back to our initial conversation, sometimes people don't discern between the two, and they have been a cause of some of the friction in our system that we've been talking about all night, and it's one more challenge we have to get our arms around.
And it feels like a relatively recent phenomenon that people could live in such non-overlapping news and information bubbles.
Yes.
You didn't used to be able to exist in a world that was entirely self-reinforcing and where nothing from this other world crept in. And it's both baffling and alarming to me that we have two or more ecosystems that never need to interact and never need to reconcile to find, okay, which part of each of these is true. You can just have your views drift further and further in one direction and be reinforced and think the other people are crazy.
Yes.
And, I have my views. I think the other people are crazy, but then I realize they think I'm crazy. And that is no way to run a democracy.
Yeah, no, we live in virtual reality silos in which our views are always affirmed, only sometimes informed, and everybody who lives outside the silo is alien and maybe even an enemy. And that is very dangerous. We've had periods in our history before, where journalism was that way, where people subscribed to the paper that colored information the way they wanted to receive it, but it wasn't as enveloping as it is now. And I frankly don't know the answer. I really don't. I mean, I try and encourage people to step outside their silos. We do that at the Institute of Politics, but it is a really powerful force, and it's one that is accelerating the polarity that we see in our public life.
Will, can you say something hopeful now?
That was going to be my last question for you, Kate. I was going to, amidst all of this, right? We've been talking about all these overwhelming challenges. Where do we find hope, right? Where do we find it? So I'll offer an answer, and I'd love to hear from the two of you to wrap it up too. And so I would say that just as there's been a lot of corrosion in the media market, just as there has been a lot of degradation of expertise within the administrative state, and I worry a lot about the health of our democracy. So too are there new voices coming forward. Many of those voices are young people, and voices that have been traditionally marginalized in our politics, who are not just coming forward, but they're getting organized. And that constitutes not just a revitalization of our politics and our democracy, but I think it gives us reason for hope that we can actually see a way forward. So that's something that I would look to in feeling hopeful. What about you, Kate? And then David, you'll go last.
Okay.
Yeah, think of something cheerful while I'm talking.
Yeah.
I think it's hard to imagine making progress on the deep structural problems we've been talking about, on the inequalities, the economic challenges, all of that, while we're in the middle of coronavirus pandemic. Like, I think we have to get past that before we can devote the energies and attention we need to these really deep and important issues. And I have some hope on that front. It's grim right now, but I've been amazed by the advances that we've seen in vaccines and therapeutics and in, the healthcare workers on the front lines and figuring out, even though infection rates are rising at alarming levels, mortality rates, treatments are getting better. I can see the light at the end of the very long tunnel of the pandemic. And I think we will get there, hopefully sooner, with good leadership and all of the coordination we've been talking about. And then we'll really be much better positioned to wrestle with all of these other issues.
So let me expropriate your answer and Will's answer. I agree on that. And it's actually been inspiring to see the mobilization of science. This is one place where I think the Trump administration deserves some credit on this Operation Warp Speed and encouraging the science. I listen, I wouldn't be at the university if I didn't find great comfort and inspiration in these young people who are skeptical but not cynical and really do see their role as trying to improve the world around them. I go home inspired every day when I'm interacting with these young people. And then finally, I just want to repeat what I said earlier. 150 million people came out in this election, perhaps more, in the midst of a pandemic, because they understood that they could grab the wheel of history and turn it in a different direction, or not. But that sense of investment, that for all the skepticism and all the cynicism, there was this belief that it mattered, that it actually matters in a democracy, that you make your voice heard, and that you can actually have an impact on the future. And I was gratified by that. I found that inspiring and awesome.
Mhm.
So I take some hope in that as well.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Kate. This was a terrific hour spent with the two of you, and thank you for
Thank
our
you.
engaged audience and all the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. There are a bunch of terrific ones here. Thanks to the Harris School for supporting this, the Center for Effective Government, the Institute of Politics. This has really been a pleasure. So,
Thank you. Thanks for a great job, Will.
Thanks all.
Kate, thank you.